23-year-old Amelia King stood in the pristine funeral home lobby, clutching a folder of handwritten notes while her mother, Patricia, hissed through gritted teeth, "Stop making a scene, Amelia. People are staring." But Amelia wasn't backing down this time. Her grandmother's funeral was in 3 days, and someone needed to honor Eleanor King's actual wishes, not the sanitized version her family preferred. What Amelia discovered in her grandmother's will would expose secrets that had been buried for decades, turning a simple funeral into the most shocking family revelation anyone could imagine. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The fluorescent lights in Riverside Memorial Funeral Home cast an unforgiving glare across the mahogany conference table where 3 generations of the King family sat in uncomfortable silence. Amelia King adjusted her black cardigan and opened her grandmother's worn leather journal, the pages filled with Eleanor's careful handwriting detailing exactly how she wanted her final goodbye to unfold. "Grandma Eleanor wanted wildflowers," Amelia began, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Specifically, she wrote about wanting sunflowers and daisies because they reminded her of the meadow behind her childhood home in Nebraska. Patricia King, Amelia's mother, let out an audible sigh and crossed her arms. At 52, Patricia had perfected the art of controlled disapproval, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun and her navy suit pressed to razor-sharp lines. "Amelia, we've already ordered the white lilies and roses. They're elegant and appropriate. Your grandmother would understand that we need to maintain some dignity here." "Dignity?" Amelia's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. The funeral director, Mr. Henderson, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Grandma Eleanor specifically wrote that she didn't want stuffy flowers. She wanted her funeral to celebrate her life, not apologize for it." Amelia's uncle, Marcus King, cleared his throat. Marcus was Patricia's younger brother, a real estate developer who wore his success like armor: expensive watch, Italian shoes, and a perpetual expression of mild irritation. "Look, kiddo, I get that you were close to Mom, but we have to think about the family's reputation. The Riverside Country Club members will be there, half the city council, prominent business owners. We can't have it looking like some hippie gathering." "She wasn't a hippie," Amelia shot back, flipping through the journal pages. "She was a retired English teacher who happened to believe in living authentically, and she specifically requested that her favorite Johnny Cash songs be played during the service, not hymns she never sang." Patricia's face flushed pink. "Absolutely not. We are not playing country music at a funeral. What would Pastor Williams think?" "Pastor Williams didn't know Grandma Eleanor," Amelia countered. "She stopped going to his church 5 years ago because she said his sermons were full of judgment and short on love. She started attending the Unitarian Fellowship downtown because they actually listened to her ideas about social justice." The revelation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Marcus and Patricia exchanged glances that spoke volumes about family secrets and carefully maintained facades. Eleanor King had been the matriarch of one of Riverside's most established families. Old money, old traditions, old expectations. The idea that she had abandoned the Presbyterian Church where 4 generations of kings had worshipped was clearly news to them. Mr. Henderson, sensing an opportunity to regain control of the situation, leaned forward with his practiced funeral director smile. "Perhaps we could find a compromise. Some traditional elements combined with personal touches that honor Mrs. King's specific wishes." "There's more," Amelia said, ignoring his diplomatic suggestion. She turned to a page marked with a faded yellow sticky note. She wanted her eulogy to include stories about her activism in the 1960s, the civil rights marches she participated in, the anti-war protests, her work with the Underground Railroad helping draft resistors get to Canada. Patricia's composure finally cracked. "Amelia Rose King, that is enough. Your grandmother never told us about any of this because it never happened. You're making up stories based on some fantasy notebook." "It's not fantasy, Mom. It's her life. The life she lived before she had to pretend to be someone else to fit into Dad's family expectations." The mention of Amelia's late father, Patricia's husband, who had died when Amelia was 15, shifted the room's energy. Richard King had been the golden boy of Riverside society, star athlete, successful lawyer, city council member. His sudden heart attack had left Patricia to navigate the social expectations of the King family legacy while raising a teenage daughter who increasingly refused to conform. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, his expression calculating. Amelia, I think you're misunderstanding something fundamental here. Your grandmother was a wonderful woman, but she was also elderly. Sometimes people's memories get creative as they age. They start believing stories they've heard or seen in movies are actually their own experiences. She wasn't senile, Amelia said firmly. Her mind was sharp until the end. And these aren't random stories, they're documented. She kept newspaper clippings, photographs, letters from friends she met during protests. I found boxes of this stuff in her attic when I was helping her organize last month. Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the funeral home's plush carpet. We are not turning your grandmother's funeral into some political statement. The service will be traditional, respectful, and appropriate for our family standing in this community. End of discussion. But it's not our funeral, Amelia said quietly. It's hers. And she left detailed instructions about what she wanted because she knew this would happen. She knew you'd try to erase the parts of her that made you uncomfortable. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Henderson shuffled through his papers, clearly hoping someone would make a decision so he could move on to his next appointment. Marcus checked his phone with the practiced indifference of someone accustomed to family drama. Patricia remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides, looking for all the world like a woman whose carefully constructed reality was beginning to crumble. Amelia opened the journal to another marked page. She also wanted her friend Dorothy Washington to speak at the service. They met during a voter registration drive in 1965 and stayed friends for over 50 years. Dorothy has stories about Grandma Eleanor that none of us have ever heard. Dorothy Washington, Marcus repeated slowly. The woman who runs that community center downtown? The one who's always organizing protests and making noise about affordable housing? The same Dorothy Washington who taught literacy classes to adults for 30 years and helped hundreds of people get their GEDs, Amelia corrected. Dorothy Washington, who was Grandma Eleanor's closest friend and who knows more about her real values than any of us apparently do. Patricia sat back down heavily, suddenly looking older than her 52 years. Amelia, you have to understand. Your father worked very hard to build our family's reputation in this town. The Kings have been pillars of this community for generations. We have responsibilities, expectations to uphold. Whose expectations? Amelia asked. The country club friends who never really knew Grandma Eleanor? The business associates who saw her maybe twice a year at charity galas? Or the people she actually cared about, her students, her activist friends, the community organizations she quietly supported for decades? The question hit its mark. Patricia's carefully maintained composure wavered as she realized her daughter had uncovered a version of Eleanor King that challenged everything the family had believed about themselves. The grandmother Amelia described wasn't the quiet, traditional matriarch they thought they knew, but a woman with deep convictions and a hidden history of standing up for her beliefs. Marcus cleared his throat again, this time with less confidence. Look, even if some of these stories are true, we still need to consider the impact on the family. I'm trying to close a major development deal next month. Patricia's on the board of 3 different charities. We can't afford to have people questioning our family's values or stability. What about Grandma Eleanor's values? Amelia demanded. What about the woman who actually lived this life and earned the right to have her story told honestly? The journal in Amelia's hands felt heavier with each revelation, as if the weight of her grandmother's secret history was becoming too much to bear. But she wasn't finished. Eleanor King's final wishes included much more than flower choices and music selections, and Amelia was beginning to understand that this funeral planning battle was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. 2 days before the funeral, Amelia drove her beat-up Honda Civic through the winding streets of Riverside's historic district, past the manicured lawns and colonial mansions that had housed the city's elite for over a century. Eleanor King's Victorian home stood at the end of Magnolia Avenue, its wraparound porch and intricate gingerbread trim a testament to another era's craftsmanship. The house felt different now, empty in a way that went beyond Eleanor's physical absence. Amelia had spent countless afternoons here as a child, listening to her grandmother's stories while helping tend the sprawling garden that Patricia had always dismissed as overgrown. Now, with the funeral looming and her family's resistance stronger than ever, Amelia needed to find concrete proof of Eleanor's hidden history. The attic access was through a narrow staircase behind the kitchen pantry, a detail that had always seemed mysterious to young Amelia. Eleanor had occasionally disappeared up those stairs, returning with photo albums or old books, but had never invited anyone to explore the space with her. Now, pulling down the wooden ladder and climbing into the dusty darkness, Amelia understood why. The attic was a carefully organized archive of a life lived in two worlds. Dozens of cardboard boxes lined the slanted walls, each labeled in Eleanor's precise handwriting. March on Washington, 1963. Anti-war correspondence, 1968 to 1971. Voter registration, Mississippi, 1965. Underground Railroad, Canada, letters. A filing cabinet in the corner contained manila folders thick with newspaper clippings, photographs, and official documents that told the story of Eleanor King's secret activism. Amelia opened the box marked March on Washington with trembling hands. Inside, she found a program from the historic civil rights rally, signed by several participants, along with photographs of a young Eleanor standing in crowds of protesters. In one image, Eleanor held hands with other demonstrators as they sang, her face radiant with purpose and conviction. This wasn't the quiet grandmother who served tea in delicate china cups. This was a woman who had risked everything to fight for justice. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The anti-war materials were even more extensive. Letters from young men Eleanor had helped flee to Canada to avoid the Vietnam draft, thank you notes from families whose sons had found safe passage through the underground network she had helped coordinate. One letter, dated 1969, was from a boy named Tommy Chen, who wrote, "Mrs. King, because of your courage, I'm alive and studying engineering at the University of Toronto instead of dying in a jungle I never should have entered. My children will know your name." Amelia's hands shook as she photographed the documents with her phone. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of Eleanor as someone who had consistently chosen moral courage over social acceptance, even when it meant living a double life. The woman who attended charity luncheons and garden club meetings had secretly been funding draft resistors and organizing voter registration drives in communities where such work was dangerous. A knock at the front door interrupted her discoveries. Amelia climbed down from the attic, brushing dust from her clothes, and opened the door to find Dorothy Washington standing on the porch. Dorothy was a tall, elegant woman in her 70s, her silver hair arranged in neat braids and her brown eyes sharp with intelligence. She wore a simple black dress and carried a covered casserole dish. "Child, I came to bring some food and see how you're holding up," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone accustomed to taking care of others. "Eleanor told me you might need some support when this time comes." "She told you?" Amelia stepped aside to let Dorothy enter. "You knew she was dying?" Dorothy nodded, settling the casserole on Eleanor's dining room table. "Your grandmother knew her heart was failing months ago. She asked me to watch out for you when the family started fighting about the funeral arrangements. Said you were the only one who might actually listen to what she wanted." "They don't believe any of it," Amelia said, gesturing toward the attic. "They think she made up stories about being an activist. My mom actually suggested she was getting senile." Dorothy's laugh was rich and knowing. Eleanor King was many things, but senile wasn't one of them. That woman had a memory like a steel trap and a moral compass that never wavered, even when it cost her dearly. "What do you mean, cost her?" Dorothy moved to Eleanor's mantelpiece, where family photos displayed 3 generations of kings in formal poses. She picked up a wedding photo of Eleanor and her late husband, Charles King, both looking impossibly young and elegant. Your grandfather was a good man, but he was also a product of his time and social class. Eleanor's activism caused considerable tension in their marriage, especially after your father was born. Dad knew about this? Richard knew some of it. Eleanor tried to involve him when he was younger, took him to a few peaceful protests, taught him about social justice, but Charles put his foot down when Richard started asking questions that might have been awkward at the country club. By the time Richard was a teenager, Eleanor had learned to keep her two worlds completely separate. The revelation hit Amelia like a physical blow. Her father, the man she had idolized as the perfect King family representative, had once been exposed to his mother's activist values, but had chosen the safer path of social conformity. Dorothy continued, her voice gentle but firm. Eleanor spent 40 years living 2 lives, the respectable society matron your family needed her to be, and the justice warrior she truly was. The only time those worlds collided was when she was helping people who needed her, regardless of what it might cost her socially. But why did she hide it from us? Why didn't she tell me these stories when I was growing up? Because your father asked her not to. Dorothy's words carried the weight of decades-old pain. After Richard married your mother, he made it clear that Eleanor's political activities could damage his legal career and his standing in the community. He asked her to tone down her involvement, to focus on being a traditional grandmother. Amelia sank into Eleanor's favorite armchair, overwhelmed by the complexity of her family's hidden dynamics. So she just stopped? She never stopped, child. She just got more creative about how she expressed it. All those charity events your mother talks about, Eleanor used them to quietly fund money to civil rights organizations. The garden club meetings? Half the time, Eleanor was meeting with other women who shared her values to coordinate their behind-the-scenes activism. Your grandmother found ways to live her principles while maintaining the peace with her family. The weight of this compromise, decades of suppressing her true self to keep her family comfortable, made Eleanor's final wishes even more significant. Her detailed funeral instructions weren't just about flowers and music. They were about finally, publicly reclaiming the identity she had hidden for so long. She wanted this funeral to tell the truth, Amelia realized, not just about how she died, but about how she lived. Dorothy nodded. Eleanor spent her last months organizing everything, not just the funeral plans, but legal documents, financial arrangements, even letters she wanted delivered to specific people. She knew your family would resist, so she tried to make it as easy as possible for someone to carry out her real wishes. What kind of legal documents? Dorothy's expression grew serious. That's something you'll need to discuss with her lawyer, James Mitchell. Eleanor asked me to make sure you contacted him before the funeral. She said there were some things about her estate that might surprise the family. A chill ran down Amelia's spine. Eleanor's mysterious comment about people being shocked at the will reading suddenly seemed more ominous than she had originally thought. Dorothy, what aren't you telling me? It's not my place to reveal everything, honey, but I will say this. Your grandmother spent her final years making some very deliberate choices about her legacy. The funeral arrangements are just the beginning. Eleanor King decided she was done living other people's version of her life, even if it meant creating some uncomfortable truths for the family she loved. As Dorothy prepared to leave, she handed Amelia a thick manila envelope. Eleanor asked me to give you this when you were ready to hear the whole story. Inside, you'll find addresses and phone numbers for people who knew the real Eleanor. Activists, former students, community organizers who worked with her over the years. She wanted you to know that her impact went far beyond what your family ever realized. Standing in her grandmother's empty house, surrounded by the evidence of a secret life lived with courage and principle, Amelia began to understand that the funeral planning battle was about much more than flowers and music. It was about the fundamental question of who gets to control a person's story after they're gone, and whether the truth is worth the chaos it might create. The morning of Eleanor's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, as if the sky itself was mourning the loss of someone whose true impact on the world had been hidden for far too long. Amelia stood in her childhood bedroom at her mother's house, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to 3 generations of king women. She wore a simple black dress, not the designer outfit Patricia had suggested, but something Eleanor would have approved of. The compromise they had reached the night before felt hollow. White lilies and roses would fill the church, traditional hymns would be played, and Pastor Williams would deliver a sanitized eulogy about Eleanor's role as a devoted wife and mother. The only concession Amelia had won was permission for Dorothy Washington to speak briefly about Eleanor's community service work, language carefully chosen to avoid any mention of activism or protests. Amelia's phone buzzed with a text from James Mitchell, Eleanor's attorney. "Need to speak with you urgently before the service. Can you meet me at the church office in 20 minutes? It's about your grandmother's final instructions." The urgency in his message sent a spike of anxiety through Amelia's chest. She had spoken with Mitchell briefly the day before, but he had been cryptic about Eleanor's estate arrangements, saying only that all details would be revealed at the formal will reading scheduled for the day after the funeral. 20 minutes later, Amelia found herself in the cramped office behind Riverside Presbyterian Sanctuary, facing James Mitchell across a desk covered with legal documents. Mitchell was a thin, scholarly man in his 60s who had been Eleanor's attorney for over 30 years. His usually calm demeanor seemed strained, and he kept adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as if trying to bring something into clearer focus. "Amelia, I need to prepare you for something that's going to shock your family," Mitchell began, his voice carefully measured. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions about her funeral service, and she anticipated that your family would resist them. She asked me to intervene if necessary." "What kind of instructions?" Mitchell opened a thick folder and pulled out a document bearing Eleanor's signature and an official notary seal. "This is a legal directive regarding her funeral service. Eleanor specified that if her family altered her wishes in any significant way, I was authorized to halt the proceedings and ensure her actual requests were honored." Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. "You can do that?" She made it legally binding. Eleanor was very concerned that her family would prioritize their social image over her personal values, so she took steps to protect her final wishes. Mitchell handed her a copy of the document. "She also left instructions for me to reveal certain information during the service if needed, information that she believed would help people understand why her specific requests were so important to her." The implications were staggering. Eleanor hadn't just hoped her family would respect her wishes, she had created legal safeguards to ensure they had no choice. What kind of information? Details about her activism, her charitable work that was never publicly acknowledged, and the extent of her financial contributions to causes that your family might find surprising. Mitchell's careful word choice made it clear that surprising was a diplomatic understatement. Amelia's mind raced. "Are you saying she wants you to expose her secret life during the funeral service?" "Only if necessary. Eleanor hoped that you would be able to convince your family to honor her wishes voluntarily. But if they continued to resist, she wanted the truth to come out in a way that would help people understand who she really was." The sound of cars pulling into the church parking lot reminded them both that the service would begin in less than an hour. Amelia looked at the legal document in her hands, Eleanor's signature, a stark reminder that her grandmother had been planning this revelation for months, maybe years. "There's more," Mitchell continued. "Eleanor asked me to give you this if it became clear that your family wasn't going to respect her wishes." He handed her a sealed envelope with, "For Amelia, to be opened only if they don't listen," written in Eleanor's careful script. With trembling fingers, Amelia opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Eleanor's words, written in the purple ink she had always preferred, seemed to speak directly from beyond the grave. "My dearest Amelia, if you are reading this letter, it means that my family has chosen their reputation over my truth, just as I feared they would. I have spent 43 years hiding the parts of myself that they found inconvenient or embarrassing, and I refuse to let them bury those parts of me along with my body. The woman they want to memorialize today, the quiet, traditional grandmother who never caused trouble, is only half of who I was. The other half organized voter registration drives, helped young men escape an unjust war, and used my privileged position to fight for people who had no voice in this community. I know this revelation will be difficult for your mother and uncle. They have worked hard to build their social standing, and they fear that my political activities will reflect poorly on them. But I hope that someday they will understand that standing up for justice is never something to be ashamed of, even when it's inconvenient. You are the only one in our family who has shown the courage to question authority and fight for what you believe is right. That's why I'm trusting you with this decision. If my family refuses to honor my wishes, I want the truth to be told during my funeral service. Let people know that Eleanor King lived according to her values, not just her social obligations. In the filing cabinet in my bedroom, you will find a folder marked Legacy Project. Inside are letters from people whose lives I touched through my activism. Former students who went on to become teachers and activists themselves, young men whose lives I helped save during the Vietnam War, families I helped register to vote despite threats and intimidation. I also want you to know about the financial arrangements I have made. Over the past 15 years, I have been quietly transferring portions of my estate to organizations that carry on the work I believed in. Civil rights groups, educational foundations, and community organizations that serve the people your family's social circle often ignores. The reading tomorrow will reveal these arrangements, and I suspect your mother and uncle will be shocked by how much money I donated to causes they never knew I supported. I hope they will eventually understand that this was not a betrayal of our family, but an expression of the values that should define us. You have always been my greatest source of pride, Amelia. Your refusal to conform to other people's expectations reminds me of myself at your age, before I learned to hide my convictions for the sake of family peace. Don't make the same mistake I made. Live your truth boldly, even when it's difficult. If you choose to reveal my activism during the funeral service, James Mitchell has prepared a presentation that includes photographs, newspaper clippings, and testimonials from people who knew the real me. It will be uncomfortable for your family, but it will also give everyone present a chance to understand the full scope of the life I lived. The choice is yours, my dear. Honor my wishes with the simple service I requested, or reveal everything and let the world know that Eleanor King was more than the sum of her social obligations. With all my love and faith in your judgment, Grandmother Eleanor. P.S. Check the small safe behind the painting of the lighthouse in my study. The combination is your birth year. Inside, you will find something that explains why this revelation is so important to me. Amelia's hands shook as she finished reading. The letter felt like a bomb with a lit fuse, and she was holding it in a room full of explosives. Through the office window, she could see people beginning to gather in the church sanctuary. Family friends, business associates, members of the community who knew only the public version of Eleanor King. In less than an hour, she would have to decide whether to let them continue believing that version was the whole truth, or whether to expose the secret life that had defined her grandmother's real legacy. The weight of Eleanor's final request, and the legal authority to carry it out, settled on Amelia's shoulders like a heavy cloak. Mitchell cleared his throat gently. "What would you like me to do?" Amelia looked out at the gathering crowd, then back at her grandmother's letter. Somewhere in that sanctuary, her mother and uncle were probably arranging flowers and checking the program, confident that they had successfully sanitized Eleanor's farewell to meet their social standards. They had no idea that their carefully orchestrated tribute was about to be challenged by the woman they thought they knew so well. "Give me 10 more minutes," Amelia said, tucking the letter into her purse. "I need to make a decision that's going to change everything." Amelia drove through Riverside's empty Sunday morning streets with Eleanor's letter burning a hole in her purse, and 15 minutes to make a choice that would either preserve family harmony or shatter it completely. The lighthouse painting in Eleanor's study had always seemed like an odd choice for someone who lived hundreds of miles from the ocean,
but now it might hold the final piece of a puzzle that was already reshaping everything Amelia thought she knew about her family.
Eleanor's Victorian house felt different in the morning light, not empty anymore, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Amelia fumbled with Eleanor's spare key, her hands still shaking from the morning's revelations. The study was exactly as Eleanor had left it, books arranged with military precision, her reading glasses folded neatly on the mahogany desk, and the lighthouse painting hanging innocuously above the built-in bookshelf. The painting swung aside easily on hidden hinges, revealing a small wall safe with a digital lock. Amelia's birth year, 2001, opened it with a soft click. Inside, she found a manila envelope, a small velvet jewelry box, and a USB drive labeled "for the presentation," if needed. The envelope contained a single photograph and a letter written on different paper than Eleanor's usual stationery. The photograph showed a much younger Eleanor, maybe 25, standing next to a tall black man in military uniform. They were both smiling, holding hands in what appeared to be a garden setting. On the back, Eleanor had written, "James and Eleanor, June 1967, before the world told us we couldn't love each other." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. James. Not her grandfather Charles, whom Eleanor had married in 1969. This was someone else entirely, someone whose existence had been completely erased from the family narrative. The letter was dated just 2 months before Eleanor's death. Amelia, if you have found this photograph, then you have chosen to unlock the most painful secret I have carried for 57 years. The man in this picture is James Crawford, the love of my life, and the reason I became an activist. James was a medic in Vietnam, but not by choice. He was drafted in 1966, during the height of the war. We met at a civil rights rally in Chicago, where he was home on leave. He had joined the protests not just because he believed in racial equality, but because he understood that poor black men were dying disproportionately in a war that rich white men had started. We fell in love over 3 weeks of late-night conversations about justice, equality, and the kind of world we wanted to build together. James proposed to me in Lincoln Park, with a simple ring he had bought with his army pay. I said yes without hesitation, even though I knew my family would disown me and his family feared for our safety. James was killed in action 3 months later, not in combat, but in a helicopter crash while evacuating wounded soldiers. He died trying to save other people's lives, which was exactly the kind of man he was. I received word of his death the same day I discovered I was pregnant with his child. In 1967, an unmarried white woman carrying a black man's child faced impossible choices. My family was horrified when I told them about James, and they were terrified of the scandal that would follow if the pregnancy became public knowledge. They arranged for me to spend 6 months with my aunt in California, where I could have the baby in secret and give him up for adoption. His name was David James Crawford King. I held him for exactly 2 hours before a social worker took him to his adoptive family. I never saw him again, but I never stopped thinking about him. Every civil rights march I attended, every voter registration drive I organized, every young man I helped escape to Canada during the war, it was all in honor of James and the son we could never raise together. Your grandfather Charles knew about James and David when he married me 2 years later. He was a kind man who offered me respectability and social acceptance in exchange for never speaking about my past. I accepted his proposal because I was tired of grieving alone, and because I hoped that living a conventional life might ease the pain of losing everything I had truly wanted. Charles gave me a good life and a son I loved deeply, your father, Richard. But I never stopped being the woman who had loved James Crawford, and I never stopped working for the causes that had brought us together. My activism was my way of keeping that love alive, even when I couldn't speak about it publicly. The jewelry box in the safe contains James's engagement ring and a few letters he wrote to me before he died. I have treasured them for 57 years, along with the only photograph I have of us together. The USB drive contains documents about David, his adoption records, school achievements that his adoptive parents shared with me through intermediaries, and recent information about his adult life that might shock you.
David James Crawford became Dr. David Crawford, a civil rights attorney in Detroit. He has spent his career fighting housing discrimination and police brutality cases. He married a teacher named Angela, and they have 2 children, your half-siblings that you never knew existed. David knows about me. He hired a private investigator to find his birth parents when he turned 35, and we have been corresponding secretly for the past 15 years. He knows about your father, about you, and about the family that circumstances prevented him from joining. He has respected my need for privacy, but he has always hoped that someday he might be acknowledged as part of the King family legacy. If you choose to reveal my activism during the funeral service, I hope you will also reveal the love story that motivated it. James Crawford was a war hero who died serving his country, and David Crawford is a man any family should be proud to claim. Their stories are part of my story, and my story is part of yours. The choice is still yours, Amelia. You can replace this photograph and these documents in the safe, allow my funeral to proceed as your family prefers, and let these secrets die with me. Or you can honor the fullness of who I was, not just the grandmother who baked cookies and attended charity luncheons, but the woman who loved deeply, lost profoundly, and spent the rest of her life fighting for the justice that James believed in.
If you choose revelation, know that it will be painful for everyone involved. Your mother will struggle with learning that her husband had a half-brother he never knew about. Your uncle will worry about the impact on the family's social standing. But you will also be giving David the acknowledgement he has waited for his entire life, and you will be ensuring that James Crawford's memory is finally honored publicly. Whatever you decide, know that I love you more than words can express. You have always been the bridge between who I had to be and who I really was. Trust your heart, my dear one. It has never led you astray. With eternal love, Grandmother Eleanor. Amelia sank into Eleanor's desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just learned. Eleanor hadn't just hidden her activism from the family, she had hidden an entire love story, a lost child, and a secret correspondence that had lasted for decades. The funeral planning battle that had seemed so important yesterday now felt trivial compared to the revelation that she had a half-uncle she had never known existed. The velvet jewelry box contained a simple gold band and 3 letters, their edges worn soft from decades of handling. Even without reading them, Amelia could see that they were love letters, the kind of raw, honest communication that made James Crawford real in a way that the photograph alone couldn't capture. Her phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from her mother. "Where are you? The service starts in 20 minutes. People are asking where you are. Amelia, this is not the time to disappear." But Amelia couldn't move. She sat surrounded by evidence of her grandmother's secret life, holding the USB drive that supposedly contained information about David Crawford's current circumstances. The weight of Eleanor's final request had just tripled. She wasn't just being asked to reveal her grandmother's activism, but to potentially reunite a family that had been separated by racism, war, and social convention for over 50 years. The church bells of Riverside Presbyterian began chiming the hour, their solemn tones carrying across the quiet residential neighborhood. In 20 minutes, mourners would fill the sanctuary expecting a traditional farewell to a conventional woman. They had no idea that they might instead witness the revelation of one of the most profound love stories and family secrets in Riverside's history. Amelia tucked the photograph, letters, and USB drive into her purse alongside Eleanor's earlier correspondence. She had run out of time to process what she had learned, but she couldn't run out of courage. Eleanor King had trusted her with the most important decision of both their lives, and the church bells were calling her to choose between comfortable lies and devastating truths. As she locked Eleanor's house for what she suddenly realized might be the last time as a family secret keeper, Amelia understood that the next hour would either bury Eleanor's truth forever or set it free in a way that would transform not just her family, but everyone who thought they knew what love, sacrifice, and courage actually looked like. Riverside Presbyterian Church had never felt smaller than it did when Amelia slipped through the heavy wooden doors with 2 minutes to spare. The sanctuary was packed with exactly the crowd her mother had hoped for.
city council members in the front rows, country club friends filling the middle sections, and business associates clustered near the back. White lilies and roses created a pristine altar display that would have made any society photographer proud. Patricia King stood at the front of the church in animated conversation with Pastor Williams, her hands gesturing emphatically as she no doubt delivered final instructions about keeping the service appropriately dignified. Marcus paced near the guest book, checking his watch and scanning the crowd with the calculating gaze of someone mentally networking even at a funeral. Neither of them noticed Amelia's arrival, which gave her precious moments to steel herself for what was about to happen. James Mitchell stood discreetly near the side entrance, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. When their eyes met, he raised his eyebrows in silent question. Amelia nodded once, and she saw his shoulders straighten with purpose. Dorothy Washington sat in the third row, surrounded by a group of elderly black women who clearly hadn't been part of Patricia's guest list planning. Their presence created a subtle tension in the sanctuary. Not hostile, but definitely noticeable to anyone paying attention to the church's social dynamics. The service began conventionally enough. Pastor Williams delivered opening remarks that painted Eleanor as a devoted wife, loving mother, and pillar of the community. The first hymn was Amazing Grace, sung with the restrained emotion that marked proper Presbyterian worship. Everything proceeded exactly as Patricia had orchestrated, until James Mitchell rose from his seat and walked toward the pulpit. "Excuse me, Pastor Williams," Mitchell said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary's acoustics. "I need to interrupt for a moment to fulfill Mrs. Eleanor King's final legal instructions regarding her funeral service." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was immediate and uncomfortable. Patricia's face went white, then red, then back to white as she realized her worst fears were materializing. Marcus started to stand, but Mitchell's next words froze him in place. Mrs. King left specific legal directives about her funeral service, including the requirement that certain information be shared if her original wishes were not honored. Mitchell opened his portfolio and pulled out the document Amelia had seen earlier. She anticipated that her family might prioritize social convention over her personal values, and she took steps to ensure her true story would be told.
"This is highly irregular," Pastor Williams protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The legal document in Mitchell's hand clearly carried authority that superseded pastoral control. "Eleanor King was not the woman you think you knew," Mitchell announced to the stunned congregation. "For over 50 years, she lived two lives: the respectable society matron her family needed her to be, and the passionate activist she truly was." A projection screen descended from the ceiling, equipment that Eleanor had apparently arranged to have installed weeks earlier under the pretense of modernizing the church's memorial services. The first image that appeared was the photograph of young Eleanor at the March on Washington, her face radiant with purpose as she stood among thousands of civil rights demonstrators. The collective gasp from the congregation was audible. These weren't people accustomed to seeing their social circle associated with political protests, especially protests that many of them had probably opposed 50 years earlier. Eleanor King participated in the March on Washington in 1963, Mitchell continued. She organized voter registration drives in Mississippi during the most dangerous period of the civil rights movement. She helped coordinate the Underground Railroad that assisted draft resistors during the Vietnam War. Patricia finally found her voice. "Stop this immediately. This is not what my mother wanted. We're destroying her memory with these fabrications." But Mitchell was prepared for her objection. "Mrs. Patricia King, your mother left explicit instructions that these revelations were to be made public if her family refused to honor her wishes. She spent months documenting her activism specifically for this purpose." The slides continued. Eleanor with voter registration volunteers, Eleanor at anti-war protests, newspaper clippings featuring her name in connection with various civil rights activities. Each image challenged the congregation's assumptions about the quiet, traditional woman they thought they were mourning. Dorothy Washington stood up slowly, her dignity commanding attention even in the chaos. "Eleanor King saved my life in 1965, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary.
When white supremacists burned down the community center where I was teaching literacy classes, Eleanor showed up the next morning with supplies, volunteers, and a new location. She didn't ask for credit or recognition, she just did what needed to be done. Other voices began joining Dorothy's. An elderly white man near the middle of the church stood up. Eleanor helped my son get to Canada in 1968 when he couldn't bring himself to kill people in Vietnam. She saved him from a war that would have destroyed his soul. A middle-aged black woman in the back called out, "Mrs. King paid for my college education when no one else would help. She found scholarship money from organizations I'd never heard of, and she never let me thank her properly." The testimonials were spontaneous and powerful, painting a picture of Eleanor as someone whose impact had touched lives across racial and class lines in ways that her own family had never known about. But Mitchell wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's something else Eleanor wanted you to know," he said, advancing to the next slide. The photograph of Eleanor with James Crawford filled the screen. Two young people holding hands, their love evident in every line of their faces. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the protesters and supporters stopped speaking as they tried to process what they were seeing. In 1967, Eleanor King fell in love with James Crawford, a black medic who was serving in Vietnam. They were engaged to be married when James was killed in action 3 months later. Eleanor was pregnant with his child. Patricia made a strangled sound that might have been a scream or a sob. Marcus grabbed the back of a pew to steady himself. The congregation sat frozen, caught between fascination and horror at witnessing such an intimate family revelation in public. Eleanor gave birth to David James Crawford in California, where her family had sent her to avoid scandal. She was forced to give him up for adoption, and she spent the next 57 years grieving the loss of both the man she loved and the child she could never acknowledge. Mitchell paused, letting the weight of Eleanor's sacrifice settle over the crowd. Every civil rights march Eleanor attended, every voter registration drive she organized, every young man she helped escape to Canada during the war, it was all in honor of James Crawford and the son she lost. Her activism was her way of keeping their love alive when society told her she had to forget it ever existed. The final slide was a recent photograph of Dr. David Crawford with his own family, clearly labeled with his name and profession. David Crawford became a civil rights attorney in Detroit. He has spent his career fighting housing discrimination and police brutality cases. He married a teacher named Angela, and they have 2 children. Eleanor had been corresponding with him secretly for 15 years, hoping that someday her family might acknowledge him as the son and brother he should have been. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Eleanor King, the woman they had all thought they knew, had loved across racial lines, lost everything that mattered to her, and spent decades fighting for justice while maintaining a facade of conventional respectability. Amelia stood up slowly, her legs shaking but her voice clear. "My grandmother asked me to make this choice," she said. "She could have taken these secrets to her grave and let you continue believing your version of her story. Instead, she trusted me to decide whether her truth was worth your discomfort."
Patricia was crying openly now, not the dignified tears of a proper funeral, but the raw sobs of someone whose entire understanding of her family had just collapsed. Marcus looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "Eleanor King lived authentically when it counted," Amelia continued, "even when it cost her everything she wanted. She loved deeply, lost profoundly, and spent the rest of her life honoring that love through service to others. That's the woman we should be mourning today. That's the legacy she wanted us to remember." The funeral had become something unprecedented in Riverside's social history, a complete revelation of hidden truth that challenged every assumption the community had made about one of its most respected families. And as Amelia looked out at the stunned faces in the sanctuary, she realized that Eleanor's final gift wasn't just the truth about her own life, but a mirror that forced everyone present to examine the gap between their public personas and their private values. The Fellowship Hall of Riverside Presbyterian had never hosted a reception quite like the one following Eleanor King's funeral. Instead of the usual polite conversations about weather and vacation plans, clusters of people huddled together in intense discussions about everything they had just learned. The carefully arranged finger sandwiches and tea service seemed absurdly inadequate for the emotional earthquake that had just shaken the congregation. Patricia King stood in the corner near the kitchen entrance, accepting condolences with the shell-shocked expression of someone still processing that her entire understanding of her mother had been obliterated in the span of 30 minutes. Well-meaning church ladies offered the usual platitudes. "She's in a better place now. What a beautiful service. You must be so proud," without seeming to realize that the woman they were comforting had just discovered that her mother had lived a secret life for decades. Marcus had disappeared entirely, presumably to his car, where he could make damage control phone calls to business associates and country club friends who had witnessed the family's most private secrets being exposed in spectacular fashion. The real estate developer who had spent his career carefully managing his public image now faced the impossible task of explaining why his mother had been a civil rights activist whose story had never been mentioned at family gatherings. Amelia moved through the reception like a sleepwalker, accepting handshakes and hearing fragments of conversations that revealed how completely Eleanor's revelations had shifted people's perspectives. Mrs. Henderson from the garden club whispered to her neighbor about remembering Eleanor's mysterious absences during the 1960s that now made perfect sense. City Councilman Robert Shaw stood near the memorial photo display, studying the images of Eleanor's activism with the expression of someone reconsidering every interaction he had ever had with her. Dorothy Washington approached Amelia near the coffee station, her eyes bright with tears that seemed to be equal parts grief and vindication. "Your grandmother would be so proud of what you did today," she said, squeezing Amelia's hand. "Eleanor spent 50 years hiding her light under a bushel to keep peace with people who never deserved that sacrifice." "I'm not sure my family will ever forgive me," Amelia replied, glancing toward her mother, who was now sitting alone at a corner table, looking devastated. "Maybe forgiveness isn't the goal," Dorothy said gently. "Maybe the truth is. Eleanor chose truth over comfort today, and so did you. That takes more courage than most people possess." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the fellowship hall entrance. A tall black man in his 50s had entered, followed by a woman and two teenagers. He moved with quiet dignity, scanning the room as if looking for someone specific. Several congregation members stared openly, not with hostility necessarily, but with the kind of intense curiosity reserved for unexpected developments in an already unprecedented day. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man from the photograph she had seen just hours earlier. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same gentle bearing that had made James Crawford so compelling in Eleanor's secret pictures. This was David Crawford, the son Eleanor had been forced to give away, standing in the fellowship hall of the church where his mother had just been eulogized. "Excuse me," David said to the room in general, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing crowds. "My name is Dr. David Crawford. I believe I'm Eleanor King's son." The fellowship hall fell silent with the kind of absolute quiet that follows truly shocking statements. Patricia looked up from her corner table, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been terror. The resemblance between David and Eleanor was unmistakable now that people knew to look for it. The same high cheekbones, the same expressive hands, the same way of holding his head when listening intently. James Mitchell, who had been speaking quietly with Pastor Williams, immediately moved toward David with the relief of someone whose professional responsibilities had just been clarified. "Dr. Crawford, Mrs. King asked me to watch for your arrival. She hoped you might come, but she wasn't certain you would be able to make travel arrangements in time." "Eleanor contacted you?"
Patricia's voice carried across the silent room, pitched higher than usual with strain. She knew about this man?
Mitchell's expression was carefully diplomatic. Mrs. King had been corresponding with her son for 15 years. She left specific instructions about how to handle his arrival if he chose to attend the service. David moved toward Patricia with measured steps, his family following at a respectful distance. His wife Angela was an elegant woman with kind eyes who seemed to understand the delicacy of the situation. Their teenage children, Eleanor's grandchildren that the King family had never known existed, stayed close to their parents while taking in the ornate fellowship hall and the sea of white faces studying them with various degrees of shock and curiosity. "Mrs. King," David said, stopping a few feet from Patricia's table, "I know this is overwhelming. Eleanor, our mother, explained how difficult this revelation would be for the family she raised. I didn't come to cause pain or demand anything. I came to pay my respects to a woman who gave me life and then spent 57 years wondering if I was okay." Patricia stared at him as if he were a ghost, which in many ways he was, the materialization of a family secret that had been buried so deeply she had never suspected its existence. "You look like her," she whispered, "around the eyes, the way you stand." "She sent me photographs over the years," David replied gently. "School pictures of Richard, wedding photos, pictures of you and Amelia. I've known about my brother and niece for a long time, even though I could never contact you directly." The word brother seemed to hit Patricia like a physical blow. The revelation that her deceased husband had a half-brother fundamentally altered her understanding of Richard's history, and, by extension, her own place in the King family narrative. Amelia stepped forward, driven by an impulse she couldn't fully explain. "You have children," she said, looking at the teenagers who shared her grandmother's distinctive chin and her uncle's thoughtful expression. "Marcus and Eleanor," David said with a slight smile. "Yes, I named them after their grandfather and great-grandmother. My son Marcus is 16 and wants to be a journalist. My daughter Eleanor is 14 and plays violin. She was named for the grandmother she never met, but whose letters taught her about standing up for what's right." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Eleanor King had 2 grandchildren who bore the names of family members they had never been allowed to acknowledge, raised on stories of a grandmother whose activism had been hidden from her official family for decades. Marcus King, the original Marcus, chose that moment to return to the fellowship hall from whatever phone calls had occupied him for the past hour. He stopped dead in the doorway when he saw David, the color draining from his face as he processed the implications of the gathering around Patricia's table. "Let me guess," Marcus said with bitter humor, "another surprise from Mom's secret life?" "Your half-nephew," David replied without hostility, "son of James Crawford, the man Eleanor loved before she married your father. I'm here to honor her memory and to finally meet the family she wrote about for 15 years. Marcus moved closer, studying David's face with the intensity of someone looking for evidence of deception or fraud. What he found instead was unmistakable family resemblance and the quiet dignity of someone who had waited decades for this moment. "She never told us," Marcus said finally. 50 years of family dinners, holidays, birthdays, and she never once mentioned that Richard had a brother." "She was protecting you," David replied. "Eleanor understood that acknowledging me would have created social complications for Richard's career and your family's standing in the community. She chose your comfort over her own need to claim me publicly." Angela Crawford stepped forward for the first time, her voice warm but firm. "What my husband isn't saying is that he spent 35 years wondering if his birth family was ashamed of him. Eleanor's letters helped heal that wound, but he still grew up believing that his own people didn't want him." The weight of Eleanor's sacrifice became clearer with each revelation. She hadn't just hidden her activism to maintain family peace. She had denied herself the joy of publicly claiming a son who had become exactly the kind of man any family should celebrate. David Crawford was a successful attorney fighting for civil rights, a devoted husband and father, and a living testament to the values Eleanor had embraced in secret.
As the fellowship hall buzzed with whispered conversations about this latest development, Amelia realized that her grandmother's funeral had become something unprecedented. Not just a memorial service, but a complete reconstruction of family history that would require everyone present to reconsider everything they thought about love, sacrifice, and the price of social acceptance. The law office of Mitchell and Associates had hosted hundreds of will readings over the decades, but never one that required extra security and a room large enough to accommodate two separate families who had only discovered each other's existence 24 hours earlier. James Mitchell had arranged for the largest conference room in downtown Riverside's historic district, complete with audiovisual equipment that he suspected would be necessary for Eleanor King's final revelations. Patricia King sat at one end of the polished oak table, flanked by Marcus and Amelia. Her red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands spoke to a sleepless night spent processing the complete reconstruction of her family history. Across from them, David Crawford sat with his wife Angela and their two teenagers, all of them maintaining the careful composure of people who understood they were intruding on a grief that wasn't entirely their own.
The formal reading began with the standard legal language about Eleanor being of sound mind and disposing of her earthly possessions according to her wishes, but it quickly became clear that Eleanor's will was unlike anything Mitchell had prepared in 30 years of estate law. To my daughter-in-law, Patricia, Mitchell read, I leave my house on Magnolia Avenue and all its contents, with the understanding that she will share access to the family photographs and historical documents with David Crawford, the son I could not publicly acknowledge during my lifetime, but who always remained in my heart. Patricia's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. Even in death, Eleanor was orchestrating reconciliation between the families she had been forced to keep separate. To my beloved granddaughter, Amelia, the will continued, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my collection of first edition books, along with my eternal gratitude for having the courage to tell my truth when I no longer could. Amelia felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Eleanor had known exactly what her funeral revelations would cost and had tried to provide some comfort for the aftermath. To my son Marcus, Mitchell read, pausing briefly as both Marcus men looked up expectantly, I leave my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $200,000, with the request that he use a portion of these funds to establish a scholarship at the University of Michigan in memory of James Crawford, the man whose love taught me that justice is always worth fighting for. Marcus King, Eleanor's biological son, looked stunned. His mother's request essentially asked him to honor publicly the man whose existence had been a family secret for over 50 years. But Eleanor wasn't finished with her surprises. To David Crawford, Mitchell continued, the son I was forced to give away but never stopped loving, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all bank accounts, certificates of deposit, and investment holdings not otherwise designated. The current value of this request is approximately $1.2 million. The silence that followed was absolute. David Crawford, the secret son who had grown up wondering if his birth family was ashamed of him, had just inherited the largest portion of Eleanor's considerable estate. There's more, Mitchell said, advancing to the next section of the will. Mrs. King also established several charitable trusts over the past 5 years, funded by systematic transfers from her various accounts. These donations total approximately $800,000 and were made to organizations including the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Doctors Without Borders, and 15 different scholarship programs for low-income students. Marcus King's face had gone ashen as he processed the financial implications. His mother had quietly donated nearly $1 million to causes that contradicted everything the family's social circle claimed to believe. The King family's wealth, which had been built on conservative business practices and careful social positioning, had been systematically redirected to support progressive activism. How? Patricia whispered. How did she have that much money to give away? We never saw any major withdrawals from her accounts. Mitchell consulted his notes. Mrs. King was quite strategic about her financial planning.
She had multiple investment accounts that your family wasn't aware of, funds that she had been accumulating since the 1970s specifically for charitable purposes. She also received several substantial inheritances from activist friends over the years, people who shared her values and wanted their money to continue supporting causes they believed in. The revelation painted a picture of Eleanor as someone who had been far more financially sophisticated than anyone realized, building a hidden fortune specifically to support the causes she couldn't publicly advocate for during her lifetime. There are also personal bequests, Mitchell continued. Mrs. King left specific items to various friends and organizations. Her collection of civil rights memorabilia goes to the Riverside Historical Society, with instructions that it be displayed prominently. Her extensive correspondence with activists and political figures has been donated to the University of Michigan's Civil Rights Archive. But the most shocking bequest was still to come. Mitchell opened a separate folder containing what appeared to be corporate documents. Finally, Mrs. King purchased a building on State Street last year through a trust arrangement. The building currently houses 3 small businesses and generates approximately $60,000 annually in rental income. He paused, looking directly at David Crawford. Mrs. King has deeded this building to you, David, with specific instructions that the rental income be used to establish a community legal clinic, providing free civil rights legal services to low-income residents of Riverside. She also left detailed plans for converting the upper floors into affordable housing units. David sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his birth mother's final gift. Eleanor hadn't just left him money, she had provided him with the means to continue the justice work she had supported in secret for decades. She planned all of this, Amelia said softly, the scope of Eleanor's orchestration becoming clear. The funeral revelations, the family meeting, everything. She knew exactly how it would unfold. Mitchell nodded. Mrs. King spent the last 2 years of her life arranging every detail. She consulted with financial advisors, legal experts, and social workers to ensure that her final wishes would create maximum positive impact while forcing her family to confront the gap between their public personas and their private values.
Patricia finally found her voice. She manipulated us. Every choice we made, she had already anticipated and planned for. She loved you, David said quietly. Every letter she wrote mentioned how proud she was of Richard's success, how much she admired your charitable work, how excited she was about Amelia's college achievements. But she also understood that love sometimes requires difficult honesty. Angela Crawford spoke for the first time during the reading. Eleanor wrote to David about wanting to heal the wound that racism had created in this family. She couldn't change the past, but she could try to create a future where her grandson and granddaughter might actually know each other. Amelia looked across the table at the teenagers who shared her grandmother's DNA and her own complicated relationship with family expectations. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we decide who we want to be," David replied. "Eleanor gave us all the tools we needed to build something better than what existed before. The question is whether we have the courage to use them." Marcus King spoke for the first time since the reading began. "The scholarship fund for James Crawford. I'll establish it. Maybe it's time this family stopped running from its own history." Patricia remained silent, but she reached across the table toward David's hand. The gesture was tentative, uncertain, but it was a beginning. 6 months later, the Crawford King Community Legal Clinic opened in downtown Riverside with David Crawford as its director and Amelia King as its youngest volunteer coordinator. The scholarship fund had already provided college assistance to 12 students, and the affordable housing project was moving through city approval processes. Eleanor King's Victorian house had become an informal meeting place where 2 branches of the same family slowly learned to navigate their shared history. Patricia still struggled with the social implications of her mother's revelations, but she had begun attending Dorothy Washington's book club and asking questions about the civil rights era she had never wanted to understand. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. The weeks following the will reading brought unexpected challenges that tested everyone's commitment to Eleanor's vision of family reconciliation.
Marcus King faced professional backlash when word spread through Riverside's business community about his mother's activism and his newfound half-nephew. 3 potential real estate deals fell through when conservative clients questioned the King family's reliability and values alignment. Rather than retreating into damage control, Marcus surprised everyone by doubling down on Eleanor's legacy. At the next city council meeting, he publicly announced his support for the affordable housing project and challenged other business leaders to examine their own commitment to community development beyond profit margins. His speech, delivered with the same commanding presence that had made him successful in real estate, fundamentally shifted the local political conversation. Patricia's journey proved more complex. The revelation that her deceased husband had a half-brother triggered a cascade of questions about what else Richard might have known but never shared. She spent sleepless nights wondering whether Richard had suspected Eleanor's activism, whether he had deliberately chosen ignorance to protect his career, or whether he had been as genuinely surprised by his mother's secret life as the rest of them. David Crawford provided unexpected answers during a quiet conversation in Eleanor's kitchen 3 weeks after the will reading. He had brought photo albums documenting his own family's history, pictures of graduations Eleanor had never attended, wedding photos she had only seen through mail, grandchildren she had known only through carefully written letters. "Richard wrote to me once," David revealed, showing Patricia a letter dated 1995. "He had hired a private investigator to find me after Dad died. He wanted to meet, to apologize for the family's silence, to try to build a relationship." Patricia's hands trembled as she read her husband's careful handwriting. "I know this letter comes 26 years too late, but I've thought about you every day since I learned of your existence. Mom made choices that she believed protected our family, but those choices came at your expense. If you're willing, I'd like to try to be the brother I should have been all along." "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Patricia whispered. "Because you were pregnant with Amelia," David replied gently. "He was afraid the stress of family revelations might affect the pregnancy. He planned to tell you after Amelia was born, but then he had a heart attack. Mom found the letter on his desk and contacted me to explain what had happened." The knowledge that Richard had tried to bridge the gap between his two worlds, that he had died wanting to acknowledge David publicly, provided Patricia with a different framework for understanding her family's history. Her husband hadn't been complicit in maintaining the secret. He had been preparing to shatter it. This revelation catalyzed Patricia's gradual engagement with Eleanor's true legacy. She began attending Dorothy Washington's book club, where discussions about civil rights literature opened doors to conversations about her own family's complex relationship with social justice. The initial awkwardness of being the only white woman in a group of elderly Black activists gradually gave way to genuine friendships built on shared respect for Eleanor's memory. The community legal clinic's opening ceremony drew a crowd that would have been unimaginable before Eleanor's funeral revelations. Mayor Rebecca Chen, whose own family had faced discrimination when they immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s, cut the ribbon alongside David Crawford and Amelia King. Local news coverage featured interviews with people whose lives had been touched by Eleanor's quiet activism, creating a public record of impact that spanned 5 decades.
Tommy Chen, the draft resistor Eleanor had helped escape to Canada in 1969, traveled from Toronto with his grown children to attend the ceremony. Now a retired engineering professor, he spoke about how Eleanor's courage had saved not just his life, but the lives of his children and grandchildren who existed because she had helped him avoid an unjust war. Mrs. King never asked for recognition, he told the assembled crowd. She never wanted her name in newspapers or her picture on walls. She just wanted to help people live according to their consciences, even when the world told them they were wrong. The scholarship fund generated its own remarkable stories. The first recipient, Maria Santos, was an undocumented student whose activist mother had been mentored by Eleanor in the 1990s. Maria's acceptance speech at the University of Michigan revealed how Eleanor's influence had shaped 2 generations of her family's commitment to social justice work. "Mrs. King taught my mother that being an activist wasn't about making speeches or organizing protests," Maria said. "It was about showing up consistently for people who had no other advocates. She funded my mother's citizenship classes, helped our family navigate legal immigration processes, and never asked for anything in return except that we remember to help others the way she helped us."
The affordable housing project faced predictable opposition from Riverside's more conservative residents, but Eleanor's financial planning had anticipated this resistance. The building purchase had been structured through multiple legal entities, making it nearly impossible for opponents to block through zoning challenges or permit delays. Within 18 months, 12 families were living in renovated apartments above the legal clinic, creating a visible symbol of Eleanor's commitment to practical rather than symbolic change. Amelia's role in managing these projects transformed her relationship with her family's social position. Instead of feeling trapped by the King name's expectations, she began leveraging its influence to advance causes Eleanor would have supported. Her presentation to the Riverside Country Club about the housing project's success metrics challenged members to consider whether their charitable activities actually addressed systemic problems or merely maintained a comfortable distance from difficult realities. The annual memorial service at Eleanor's grave became a community tradition that grew larger each year. The wildflower garden that Amelia had planted in deliberate violation of cemetery regulations inspired other families to personalize their own memorial spaces, gradually transforming Riverside Memorial Cemetery from a sterile display of conformity into a more authentic reflection of the diverse lives it commemorated. 2 years after Eleanor's death, Patricia King made her most significant gesture toward embracing her mother's true legacy. She donated the family's country club membership fees to fund a new program providing free legal services to immigrant families, explaining to surprised club friends that she could no longer participate in an organization that excluded the very people Eleanor had spent her life serving. David Crawford's legal practice expanded beyond civil rights cases to include family reunification work, helping other families navigate the complex emotional terrain of acknowledging previously hidden relationships. His expertise in managing the intersection of legal requirements and family dynamics made him a sought-after consultant for adoption agencies and family counselors throughout Michigan. The ripple effects of Eleanor's revelations continued expanding in ways that surprised everyone involved. Historical societies in 3 states requested materials from Eleanor's archive for exhibits about grassroots civil rights organizing. A documentary filmmaker began working on a project about hidden activism among seemingly conventional community members, using Eleanor's story as a framework for exploring how social change happens through individual courage rather than mass movements. As Amelia stood among the wildflowers that now grew around Eleanor's headstone, sunflowers and daisies planted in defiance of cemetery regulations, she understood that her grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the revelations or even the family reconciliation. It had been demonstrated that living authentically, even when it's difficult and costly, creates ripple effects that continue long after the person who made those brave choices is gone. Eleanor King had spent 57 years hiding her truth to keep peace with people who never deserved that sacrifice. But in the end, she had chosen courage over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, and love over fear. It was a legacy that would reshape the King family and the community of Riverside for generations to come. The funeral that was supposed to maintain social appearances had instead become a revolution, proving that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply tell the truth about who you really are and what you actually believe. Eleanor King's final scene had been the most important performance of her life, and its impact would echo through every life she had touched long after the last flower on her grave had faded away. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.